Chapter 8. The Secrets of Room 13. Rick sighed. Dak had asked to get inside Room 13 as if that were something simple, as if they could just walk into the Admiralty, open the door, and peek at some of the most top-secret plans of World War II. Sure, anyone could do that. Then Sera pointed out that this was exactly the kind of thing they had to do in order to influence the war from behind the scenes. Easy for her to say. 2 kids who were caught sneaking around would just get kicked out of the building. But Rick was older than they were, and he had a job there that involved sensitive matters of national security. If he was caught, could they put him in a military prison? Could he be tried as a traitor? It wasn't a pleasant thought, but Rick knew that Dak was right. They had to get into that room. It took Rick most of the afternoon to wander the corridors of the Admiralty and its connecting buildings until he found an old, unguarded room in the basement with a window large enough for Dak and Sera to squeeze through. It was a good thing that he didn't have to come and go this way, but they were a little shorter and should be able to fit. That was where he waited for them that night. What had started as a drizzle an hour before had turned into a heavy downpour. At any other time, that would have been a problem. But tonight, it was very good news. The rain would help camouflage Dak and Sera from the soldiers who patrolled the area and hopefully lower the soldiers' guards a bit. Even so, he breathed a huge sigh of relief when the secret tap they'd devised came to the window pane. Rick inched the window open, which took more effort than he had expected. Who knew how many months or years, or decades, had passed since it was last opened? A soaked Sera crawled through first, then Dak followed. They dripped on the floor so much it was as if they had brought the rainstorm inside with them. "Next time, I'll stay in the warm building while you sneak through the rain," Dak told Rick through chattering teeth. Rick had a nice response ready, but decided to save it for later, at least until Dak looked less like a wet puppy. He started to close the window, but Sera said, "We should leave it open in case we need to make a quick escape." "Good idea." Rick frowned at the water now puddled on the floor, but decided it would dry long before anyone happened upon it. "Let's get this done." He opened the door to the hallway, and then froze, certain he had heard a shuffle in the bushes outside the window. Dak looked out, but only shrugged his shoulders. "Nobody except us is crazy enough to be out on a night like this. Must be the wind." "Come on, then." Rick led them into a narrow and dark hallway with low ceilings and worn paint. Outside, the rain seemed to have picked up speed. The pelter of drops echoed through the hallway, which masked any sound they might make, but it also made Rick nervous. It concealed any sound from an oncoming guard on his rounds, too. Room 13 was marked clearly, but for a place that held such powerful secrets, it didn't seem to be anything special. Maybe that was the idea. If a German spy got in here, the last place he'd think to look for top-secret plans was behind an ordinary door in a narrow basement. Dak stepped forward and tried the door handle. "It's locked." Sera shoved a hand in her pocket and pulled out some slim pieces of metal. "No worries. I've gotten pretty good at picking locks by now." "Excellent," Rick said. Sera went down on her knees and stuck the metal pieces inside the handle. While she did, Rick explained to Dak how the few men and women who worked inside this room mostly kept to themselves and seemed very serious about their jobs. "But they're still just regular people," he whispered. "Everyday people trying to stop a really bad guy." "Real spies don't have all the cool gadgets you see in the movies," Dak said, watching Sera struggle with the lock. "Though I sure wish we had a sonic screwdriver right about now." Rick wasn't sure he got the reference, but he raised an eyebrow knowingly. Sera continued fiddling for several minutes, all the time muttering to herself about the feel of the tumblers. Rick and Dak huddled in close to watch, and neither of them moved when she told them to back off. "I can't," she said. "This won't—" And then, halfway through a sentence that began, "We'll never—" her eyes lit up, and she exclaimed, "That did it." The lock clicked. Sera rotated it and pushed. "Let's go in," she whispered. "Why don't we all go inside?" someone behind them said in an English accent. All three kids turned and sighed in unison. A tall man with wavy brown hair, prominent cheekbones, and bushy eyebrows was motioning them inside room 13. Once inside, he turned on the lights, then shut and locked the door behind him. Sera stood between the two boys, holding each of their hands, or rather, locking their hands in a death grip. Rick would have pulled away just to preserve some blood flow in his fingers, but Sera looked like she needed his support. Okay, he was scared too. "Who are you?" Dak asked. "Call me Anton." Then he chuckled. "I've always wanted to get inside the Admiralty, but I never thought 3 kids would make it so easy for me." "So you're a spy?" Sera asked. "I suppose you could say that." His eyes rested on Sera's sack, the one with the infinity ring inside, and Rick leaned closer to block Anton's view of it. Anton continued. "But I do not work for Britain or for Germany. They're too caught up in their war to see the bigger things happening in this world." Rick jutted out his chin. "We don't care whose side you're on. We're not here to fight. We don't have anything to do with this war." Anton's smile only widened. "Maybe not this war, but our war is even bigger, eh? Time travelers?" He chuckled again. "That's right. We know what you look like now. There is no safe place for you in this era." Rick's heart sank, and Sera squeezed his hand tighter, if that was possible. He cut a glance toward Dak and saw that the younger boy's eyes were fixed on some papers on a nearby desk. Rick suppressed a groan. Even if the secrets of the universe were on those papers, it wasn't the best time for Dak to be distracted. "Do you have kids, Anton?" Sera asked. The man looked her way. "What?" Sera shrugged. "You're wearing a wedding band, and it's tarnished, so I bet you've been married a long time. Do you and your wife have any kids?" "They live very happily here in London. Why? What's it to you?" "It's nothing to me. Your kids are going to be fine," Sera said. "Because the SQ does win here. Big congratulations for that, by the way. You're about to get a lot of power and control, and pretty soon your children will have everything they want, but their children are going to have a lot to worry about. And your great-grandchildren, the ones who'll be around in the time we come from, they won't do so well at all." "Why not?" Sera continued. "The SQ is going to destroy the world. Literally destroy it. I've been there. I've seen it for myself. If you don't let us go free, your grandchildren will face one disaster after another, and your great-grandchildren will not survive to adulthood." Anton's eyes darted from one kid to the other. "You're lying." Rick shook his head. "You're a time warden, so we know what your orders are. But we are the last hope for your family. What you choose to do right now can either save them or destroy them." Anton hesitated for a moment, and then frowned. "You're lying. The SQ will save this world. In time, we will control everything and everyone. And then there will be no more war or starvation or catastrophe. The woman in red has promised it." Dak snorted, then went back to reading the paper. Anton looked offended that his speech had failed to impress any of them. He stepped closer to Dak to get his attention. "I'm deciding whether to kill you and your friends. You might at least listen to me." "Huh?" Dak looked up. "Sorry, I know you're under orders, but—" "Wow." And his voice trailed off again as his focus wandered back to the papers. Anton withdrew a pocket knife from his pants and opened the blade. "Tell you what. You all come with me nice and quiet, and I'll take you back to Tilda. She'll know what to do with you." "Hold on," Dak said. "I'll be finished in a minute." "You'll come with me now." Anton advanced with the blade angled toward Dak. "Or else." "You wouldn't be threatening me if you knew how brilliant this plan is," Dak said. But it's already in motion. What is? Getting no response, Anton strode over to Dak and shoved him aside to look at the papers for himself. When he did, Dak picked up the heavy telephone from the desk and swung it at Anton's head. The man tumbled to the ground, unconscious. "That was a great idea," Sera said. "Getting him to look at the papers so you could attack him?" "That wasn't my plan," Dak said. "I really was reading the papers. I only thought of the telephone after he pushed me." "So what's on them?" Rick asked. "We're almost out of time. They've already set sail with Major Martin's body, which means it'll wash up on the shores of Spain any day now." "Why Spain?" Sera asked. "Why not send him directly to Italy or Germany?" "That would be too obvious," Rick said. "Spain is the perfect choice," Dak said. "Officially, they're a neutral country in the war, but unofficially, a lot of people in the Spanish government are on Germany's side. So we have to hope the people who get Martin's body support Germany and slip them the phony plans," Sera said. "I think I know what we need to do about Mincemeat Man," Dak said. "But we're going to have to split up." Behind them, Anton began to stir. "Tell us about it later," Rick said. "Let's drag this guy away from the top-secret intelligence and dump him in some bushes before he wakes up." Chapter 9. Split Up. The next morning, Dak stood with Sera and Rick at the ferry docks near London. He had explained to them everything he'd read the night before while in the Admiralty, but neither of them seemed too excited about the jobs ahead. Rick handed scraps of paper to Dak and Sera with a phone number written on them. "That's for a payphone near the Admiralty," he said. "Memorize the number, then destroy the paper because we're spies now. I'll be at that phone every night at 9 o'clock my time. Call once, then hang up, then call again. That's how I'll know it's one of you." Sera shoved her paper into her pocket. "We'll both call every night. I don't like splitting up." "Me neither," Rick said. "If the body is already on its way to Spain, I won't do much good here." "If something goes wrong, we need someone here in London to warn the officials," Dak said. "You already have a job at the Admiralty, so it makes sense to keep you here, just in case." "But what if Anton comes back?" Sera asked. "Or someone like him. I knew there would be SQ among the Axis powers, but the British are fighting for their freedom and survival. How can Anton really believe he's doing the right thing by supporting the SQ over the Allies?" "Tilda lied to him," Dak said. "Just like the SQ lies to everyone else. She's made him believe that he's saving Earth from the cataclysm." "When they're the ones causing it," Rick added. "Don't worry about Anton. I'm sure it'll take him a few days to see straight again. You two just get your jobs done." "I'll make sure Spain believes Major Martin is a British officer who drowned a few days ago in the ocean," Sera said. "Not a homeless man who died from rat poison a few months ago." "I'll bet you know more about science than any of those coroners," Dak said confidently. "Fight science with science." Sera bit her lip. "Rick and I have jobs that make sense, but why do you have to go to Germany?" Dak didn't want to go behind enemy lines, but even if Rick and Sera did their jobs perfectly, none of it mattered unless Germany believed Martin's papers were real. Somehow, Dak had to get to Hitler. "He was brutal," Sera said. "If Hitler suspects you're there as a spy, just do your parts right and maybe I won't have to do anything," Dak said quickly. "Mincemeat Man was a good plan, but everything had to fall in place perfectly for the plan to work. And if it doesn't, Hitler could have you sent to the concentration camps," Sera said, "or even killed." "I'm already dealing with the cataclysm. If I can face that, then I can deal with Hitler." Dak shrugged, then a mischievous smile crossed his face. "That sounded pretty brave, right? We should remember that, for the book they write about me one day." "You better go before I lose my lunch," Rick told Dak. "Besides, you don't want to miss your boat." "You first," Dak said to Sera. She was going to use the infinity ring to warp to the morgue in Huelva, Spain, where Major Martin's body was expected to be taken. Traveling there by boat and across land could take a week or more, which would be too late. Sera nodded and ducked into a thicket of trees nearby. She pulled the infinity ring from its bag, crouched low, and then pushed the button that would send her away. Dak and Rick watched her go. And Dak was surprised to feel himself already missing her. It wasn't that he liked her, or at least he didn't like her in that way, but things were never quite right when she was gone. "Your turn," Rick said. "Is everything set?" Dak hoped so. The easiest way to get into Germany was on a shipping barge. It had come from a neutral country and was only making stops at ports for businesses unconnected to the war. Dak had spent the entire morning talking a deck supervisor's ear off until he finally said Dak could have a job swabbing decks if he would just promise to stop talking. "I'll try to call you tonight from wherever I am," Dak said. He started to walk off. Then Rick said, "Quick question. Plans like this in history, how often have they worked?" Dak frowned back at him. "Something this big? Almost never." With that, he waved goodbye to Rick and looked back at the area where Sera had disappeared, then ran up the gangplank and onto the ship. Once on board, he gazed over the railings of the ship and then quickly ducked down low. Tilda was on the dock, her head darting around like a pigeon's as she scanned the area. She was searching for him and Sera and Rick, no doubt. Carefully, Dak peeked back over the railing and groaned. Rick wasn't far from her, still watching Dak's ship as it sailed away. He was completely unaware of Tilda. Tilda turned to a woman nearby to ask a question, and the woman looked Tilda over with clear disapproval before finally shaking her head and walking away. Only then did Dak pay more attention to her appearance. She had on a tight red skirt and a shiny black jacket with a bright ruby pin on the lapel. It was totally out of place for the time period and practically screamed for everyone to notice her. With her red hair pulled up high on her head, she almost looked like a burning ember of fire. In fact, in many ways, Tilda reminded Dak of fire. Get too close, and you get burned. Still on the shore, Rick gave Dak a final wave goodbye, then started to walk off. Tilda bobbed her head in Rick's direction, but Dak didn't think she had spotted him. Or had she? The ship was far from shore now. All Dak could hope was that Tilda was looking for 3 kids and ignoring the single boy walking away. By that time, the deck captain had begun shouting orders, and he put Dak to work cleaning the railings. It kept him busy, and that was better. The work helped keep his mind off of Tilda and the cataclysm, the world war, and the fact that he was heading straight into the wolf's lair. He scrubbed decks for nearly the entire day at sea, but was given a warm meal with the other crewmen that evening, shortly before the captain announced that the ship would soon be docking in Germany. When the boat came into port, Dak ditched his mop and went down to ask if there were any boxes he could unload. A crewman pointed to a small crate in the corner. "Those are goblets specially ordered in for Hitler," he said. "Carry them if you dare, but if you drop them, it'll be your head. Someone will be waiting for them on the dock." Dak picked up the wood crate, which was heavier than it looked. Why couldn't people have discovered shipping in cardboard yet? That would have saved him a few pounds. But he kept it balanced in his arms as he walked across the gangplank and onto the docks. "Are those the goblets?" The woman who asked was older, with stooped shoulders and graying hair. The wrinkles on her face were long and deep, but when she smiled, her eyes seemed warm and energetic. "Yes?" Dak felt relieved to hear his translator pick up the German language. It was the first time since he'd landed in 1943 that he needed to speak in a language other than his own. "None of them had better be broken. They're for the Führer, you know." "You work for Hitler, then?" Dak asked. "I do kitchen work at a bunker in Berlin. Nothing more." She held out her arms. "Well, hand them over." "The box is heavier than it looks," Dak said. "I'm worried you might drop them." "And if I let you carry them for me, what would you want in return?" the woman asked. "Just a ride to Berlin," Dak said. She smiled. "It's a long drive. I'd enjoy the company. But you'll have to do more than carry this box to my car. I'll also expect you to do all the unloading once we've arrived. If you work hard enough, maybe I can hire you. We need a good kitchen boy." "It's a deal." Dak was quick to agree before this opportunity passed him by. He wouldn't be anywhere near a phone tonight to call Rick, but this was more important. For better or worse, he had just found his way into the heart of enemy territory. Chapter 10. Spy Class with Klaus. Sera arrived at her coordinates in Spain with a pulsing migraine and with her body feeling as if it had not quite come back together. She wiggled her fingers to make sure they were still there and was rewarded with sensations of hot electrical currents traveling from them along her arms and into her chest. Forget the cataclysm, she thought. Time travel would destroy them much sooner. Remembering the way she had managed these feelings before, Sera backed against the nearest wall and forced herself to breathe, to just draw in a full gulp of air and release it again. Slowly, the pain faded, but she promised herself that she would not use the infinity ring again until she absolutely had to. She doubted her body could take much more. It turned out she had unknowingly backed up against just the right wall. The morgue entrance was only a few yards to one side, and from the other direction and around the corner, she could hear two men arguing. She flattened herself against the plaster and listened. With any luck, nobody would notice her there. "You must let me see that body," a man said. Even without the translator, Sera knew he was speaking in Spanish, but his accent was German. She hadn't realized there would be any Nazis here, but it seemed like a safe bet now. The person who answered had a Spanish accent. "Klaus, the man inside this morgue is a dead British officer. You are a German, an enemy to that man. Why would I let you see him?" Klaus lowered his voice, and his tone became more desperate. "Doctor, you don't understand. I am quite well connected in Germany. There are people in my country who would do anything, to get their hands on the dead officer's briefcase. I will pay you well if you only let me see what it contains." "I don't want your money, Klaus," the doctor replied. "Now you must excuse me. There are people inside who are waiting to begin." He rounded the corner with Klaus on his heels. Then they both stopped when they saw Sera. "Are you all right?" The doctor put the back of his hand against her forehead to check her temperature. Little did he know, the reason for the sweat on her brow and flushed cheeks was worse than a simple flu. Sera nodded calmly, but on the inside her pulse was racing. She had heard enough of their conversation to know that her real mission was more than just convincing Spain to accept Major Martin's fake cause of death. She had to convince Klaus, too. "I couldn't help but overhear you just now, and I can help with the postmortem," she said. "How?" The doctor's eyes narrowed. "A girl of your age has done a postmortem examination before?" "Well, no." But Sera had read about them, and even sat in once on an autopsy performed at a local hospital, just for fun. But she hadn't gotten that close to the body, and half the time her view was blocked by the doctors doing the procedure. "My name is Sera, and I'm very good with science. I can hand you tools and record your observations. I know anatomy and chemistry, and I'm a quick learner." The doctor nodded. "All right. I could use another set of hands, if you know when to stay out of our way. Come on in." The doctor went inside, but Klaus grabbed Sera's arm and pulled her back. He was so thin he almost looked unhealthy, and had a high forehead and a face that looked as if it had been cut from stone. Not a single hair on his head moved in the light breeze. Either he used gallons of gel each day, or else his hair was cut from stone, too. "Tell me everything you see in there," he said. "I'll pay you well for any information." Sera shook him off. "How much?" Klaus wasn't likely to trust her as a spy, but he obviously trusted in the power of a good bribe. He withdrew a thick wad of money from his pocket and flipped through it.
"That depends on what you tell me."
Sera felt like running away, or yelling, or doing nearly anything other than helping this man. But she was a spy now, and this was her one chance to convince Klaus she was on his side. She whispered, "If you meet me after the examination, I'll tell you everything I see." Klaus studied her a moment, then leaned in and pinched her cheeks.
"I'll pay you for information I can use," he said. "But if I find out you are lying or holding back a single detail, then you are the one who will pay."
Sera wormed from his grip, then backed away from his threats and into the morgue. There were others in the room besides the doctor. A man in a British uniform stood there looking bored. Did he know about Mincemeat Man, or was he just as confused as everyone else? Next to him was a man in a Spanish uniform who was holding a wet briefcase. Martin's, no doubt. He asked if they could hurry up, because he had already missed lunch. The doctor was working with a young attendant, and Sera thought she saw a resemblance between them. His son, perhaps? There was an American soldier, too, sitting in the corner and looking like he was about to be sick from the horrid smell in the room. None of them paid Sera much attention, except the doctor, who handed her a clipboard and told her to write down everything he dictated. And, of course, lying flat on a table was the guest of honor, Major Martin, Mincemeat Man, who was worse than dead. He looked like a full-on zombie, with sunken eyes, yellow skin, and knotted hands. Right then and there, Sera decided that she would grow up to be a physicist or a botanist or any scientist that didn't deal with dead bodies, because this was just gross. The attendant started by emptying Martin's pockets. Most of what he found was useless, just soggy old receipts, some cash, stamps, and 2 ticket stubs from a theater. Sera wondered why anyone had bothered to put all that into his pockets. None of it had anything to do with the fake plans. But then she realized it wasn't about convincing the Germans that the plans were real. It was about making the Germans believe Major Martin was real. If they thought Martin was a real British officer, they'd automatically believe his plans. Major Martin wasn't supposed to be some unfortunate homeless person who'd been holed up in a freezer for the past 3 months. He was supposed to have been alive only a few days ago, doing the things living people did. All that stuff in his pockets was genius. Next, the Spanish officer placed the briefcase on a table and unlocked it with an attached set of keys. Seawater dripped back onto the papers inside as it was opened, but that didn't matter. They were already plenty wet. On top of everything were a handful of envelopes with red wax seals over them. They looked very official, like secret military plans. Sera pictured Klaus outside, drooling in his desperation to know what was in those envelopes. After loosely sifting through the contents, the Spanish officer shut the briefcase and held it out to the British man. "You'll be wanting this back, no doubt." Sera looked at the two of them, wondering what would happen next. Of course, he should take the briefcase. It came from a British soldier and should be returned to one, especially if it contained top-secret information. The British officer's eyes widened, as if he wasn't sure what to say. Only a bumbling fool would refuse to take his country's top-secret information back. But if he did, Mincemeat Man was finished. The British officer decided to play the role of bumbling fool. "Well, your superior might not like that," he finally said. "So perhaps you should deliver it to him, and then bring it back to me, following the official route." The Spanish officer only shrugged, gathered up the items that had been in Martin's pockets, and left. The American followed. His face had gotten greener and greener with the smell, and once outside, he'd probably run for the nearest bush. With that, the doctor requested tools to begin the autopsy. Sera pressed in closer and reminded herself again that she was here not only as a scientist, but also as a spy. And spies could not get sick, no matter how disgusting this was. But when he cut into the body, her understanding of gross went to an entirely new level. The insides were rotted and watery. Sera knew how long this body had been frozen and how far the body would decompose in that time, but she couldn't let the doctor think it had been more than a few days. "So much decomposition," he wondered aloud. Strange. Maybe it's the seawater, Sera offered. If Martin had drowned at sea, the doctor would expect to find seawater in his lungs, and seawater was hard on a human body. The seawater and the heat, she added. And the skin is quite discolored, he said. Probably the effects from lack of air underwater, Sera said. It wasn't that. The man had actually died from eating rat poison, which contained high levels of phosphorus. That's what had turned his skin yellow. But she hoped the doctor wouldn't think too long or hard about it. To her, the signs that Martin hadn't died at sea were so obvious, but the doctor had no reason to suspect it was anything else, so she hoped he'd keep trying to find ways to explain Martin's condition that were consistent for a drowning. Finally, the doctor wiped his brow with the back of his arm. It's quite warm for an autopsy, don't you agree? The smell is a bit much, the British officer replied. To be thorough, I need more time. The doctor wasn't stupid, and that worried Sera. With more time, he was bound to realize Martin had been dead long before he was dumped into the sea. And if he figured that out, word would get back to the Nazis no matter what Sera told Klaus. She spoke quickly. Of course, this heat will continue to degrade the body, even worse than what's already happened since he was pulled ashore. Very soon it will be hard to know anything for sure. True. You are a bright girl. The doctor pursed his lips, then ordered his assistant to help him move the body into a wood coffin behind them. Let the death certificate state that this is a drowning victim, in the water for 8 to 10 days. Very good, the British officer said, probably too quickly. He must know about the plan, Sera thought, or at least enough to know his role in this morgue today. Before the lid went on, the doctor placed a hand on the coffin. Still, there are questions that should be answered. A drowning victim is always, nibbled on by the fish. I see none of that here. Seawater should have made his hair brittle and stiff. But it is not. Even his clothes are in better condition than I would have expected for a man floating this long in the water. As if sensing she was on his side, the British officer locked eyes with Sera. She looked up at the doctor. These are good questions. I'm sure you'll want others to come and check your work. The Germans, perhaps? The doctor frowned down at her. No, he didn't want the Germans checking his work any more than he wanted to be hung upside down and subjected to tickle torture. It is death by drowning, the doctor said firmly. That is my final conclusion. His body will be returned immediately to the British for burial. Sera nodded and recorded his findings on her clipboard, but inside, she was beaming. Operation Fix Mincemeat Man had just cleared its first hurdle. Chapter 11. Rick's Choice. The following day, after Rick had finished his assigned work, he ate his lunch near a telegraph machine so he could watch the messages being sent from Britain to various government officials in Spain. He only saw a few of them, but he could tell how carefully worded the messages were. They had to sound eager to get the body back, but not too eager. And of course, they couldn't actually get the body back until Spain had control of the documents. Everyone who seemed to know about the plan was playing it cool, but he knew better. If this went badly, the Allies wouldn't recover during this war, or ever recover, for that matter. But that night at 9 o'clock, he settled in near the payphone, waiting for calls from Dak and Sera. Rick stared harder at the phone, as if that would somehow make it ring. He hadn't heard from either of them their first night apart, but he hoped to hear something soon. Sera's part of the plan was crucial, and he was going crazy wondering if she'd had any luck. Even worse was knowing that Dak was somewhere behind enemy lines. Finally, the phone rang once and stopped. After a few seconds, it rang again. That was the signal. It was either Dak or Sera calling him. Footsteps echoed on the quiet street behind him, and Rick kept his head down. There were many officers in this area, and he didn't need to get their attention now. All he wanted was to answer the phone. "You there," a man said, addressing Rick. "Why are you out so late? Causing trouble?" "No, sir," Rick answered. "That's too bad," a woman's voice said. "Because we are." Even before he turned around, Rick knew who had come. That was Tilda's voice, cold and harsh. She made porcupines seem cuddly. Rick's legs turned to mush, and he had to force himself to turn. Tilda stood between two sloppy and unshaven men who were roughly the size of small mountains. Aside from their British uniforms, they looked nothing like soldiers. Although he couldn't see weapons in their hands, he didn't doubt for a minute that they had them. "Answer that phone," Tilda ordered. "It's for you, right?" Rick had almost forgotten it was still ringing and couldn't understand why the caller hadn't given up already. Maybe they were in trouble or needed help? But as he stared into the black eyes of Tilda and her friends, Rick began to think nobody needed more help at the moment than him. "Pick up the phone," Tilda repeated. "And if you say anything I don't like, you're going to regret it." Rick picked up the phone, and instantly, Tilda was in the phone box at his side, her ear pressed to the outside of the receiver for whatever she could hear. "Rick!" Dak's voice came through with a lot of static and sounded far away. "Rick, is that you?" "Yes," Rick stammered. "What took you so long to answer? Were you napping while Sera and I had the dangerous jobs?" Rick gritted his teeth. Sometimes he really hated that kid. "I've got problems here too, you know." "Well, unless your problem is that wicked witch of the future, it's not worse than mine," Dak said, unknowingly earning Rick a jab in the ribs with Tilda's pointy elbow. "You won't believe where I am." "I'm sure I won't," Rick said, "so there's really no reason to tell me." He bit into his last words as Tilda kicked him in the shin. Beside him, Tilda motioned that Rick should keep Dak talking. Maybe she didn't know that kid never needed any encouragement to run his mouth. "Are you okay?" Dak asked. "You sound tired," Rick finished. "And I bet you are too, since you had to travel all the way to Switzerland today." "What? No, I'm not in Switzerland. You know I went to Quietville." If Dak couldn't catch the subtle cues, Rick would try a more obvious one. "You're at the Keep Your Mouth Closed for Once hotel." "Hitler's headquarters in Berlin. They gave me a job." "Oh." Then Dak realized what Rick had just said. Finally, it seemed that Tilda had heard enough. She ducked out of the phone box and motioned at her thugs, who grabbed Rick's arms and ripped him away from the phone. One of them clamped a hand over his mouth, while the other pulled his arms behind his back and held them there. "Hello?" Dak's voice could be heard coming from the receiver, dangling by its cord. "Hello?" Tilda returned to the booth, picked up the phone, and glared at Rick for a moment before she spoke into the receiver. "You know my voice, don't you, Dak?" Her oily grin widened. "Good. Now, do you want your friend to die?" It would be okay if I did, Rick thought, and he hoped Dak would refuse to bargain for his life. Rick knew he was running out of his own timeline pretty fast, and missing the last few slides through history wouldn't make that much of a difference. But Dak must have answered no, because Tilda's smirk widened again, and she said, "Then you will tell me where the infinity ring is." Rick tried to yell out for Dak not to say anything, but the hand was still covering his mouth. He sat helplessly as Tilda listened to whatever Dak said. "You have the time travel device?" Tilda's tone was doubtful. "An object that could literally hand control of the entire world to Adolf Hitler, and you brought it with you to Germany?" Whatever Dak said in answer, Tilda wasn't buying it. "I think you're lying," she said. "I think you're trying to protect your friends. Who has it, Rick or Sera?" Rick heard Dak protesting when Tilda pulled the phone away from her ear, but her eyes only narrowed in on his. "You remember my friend Anton, correct?" He spies on the British when needed, and spies on the Germans equally well. A triple spy, Rick thought. One who had access to both sides of the war, but was loyal only to the SQ. Tilda added, Anton and another of our agents, Cleo, have access to that same headquarters. I expect Anton has made his way back to Germany by now. Rick's teeth were clenched so tightly together that he could barely speak. So? I want you to tell me if Dak has the Infinity Ring, because if he does, then my next call will be to Anton and Cleo. By tomorrow morning, Dak will be nothing but a distant memory. So, tell me, Rick, does Dak have the Infinity Ring? Rick closed his eyes to think. Dak didn't have the Infinity Ring, so nothing was really gained by lying to Tilda, and he couldn't let her make that call to Berlin and endanger Dak. But what could he possibly say to buy them all some more time? He shook his head, and then opened his eyes. Dak doesn't have the ring. Then who does? Rick tried to keep his voice even and to look straight at Tilda. None of us have it. The historian of this time period has it. Nonsense, Tilda said. The only historian in this area was killed in an air raid in Aberdeen. She smiled evilly. I'm from the future, too, remember? You've lost your one advantage. She held the phone back up to her ear and said, Listen carefully, Dak, because even though you just tried lying to me, what I'm about to tell you is the exact truth. I've got Rick, and if you do not tell me where the ring is this moment, you will never see him alive again. There was a long silence while Rick strained to hear Dak's response on the phone, but he couldn't hear anything and only knew Dak had answered when Tilda hung up the phone and turned to her thugs. The girl has it, and she's somewhere in Spain. We need to know exactly where she is. This kid can tell us? Rick shook his head. I don't know, he said. She typed in the coordinates, and I don't know them. Will she call? Tilda asked. Without Rick's help, she answered her own question. Of course she will. We just have to be patient and wait for her to get in touch. What about him? One of the thugs asked, gesturing at Rick. We have to keep him alive for now, Tilda said. We might still need his help to get that ring. It was a bad situation. All right, Rick admitted to himself, it was a terrible situation, but at least Dak was safe, and with any luck, he might even find some way to warn Sera. Or that was what he thought before Tilda picked up the telephone once more and started dialing. Who are you calling now? The other thug asked. Anton and Cleo, our friends in Berlin, Tilda said. Maybe we still need Rick alive, but we don't need Dak. Chapter 12. Dodging the SQ. Dak was in a full-blown panic by the time Tilda hung up on him. She had Rick, and who knew what she'd do to him if things didn't go her way? She also knew that Sera had the Infinity Ring. The only reason he didn't wonder if things could get any worse is because he already knew the answer. Even now, things could always get worse. He needed to help both Sera and Rick, but didn't have a single idea for how to begin. Obviously, it wouldn't do any good to call Rick back, and he had no way to contact Sera or any money to get from Berlin all the way to Spain. Dak returned to the kitchen and slumped against a wall while he tried to force himself to keep thinking. He had to calm down because if he panicked any worse, he'd do something crazy like rip off all his clothes and start running in circles, screaming. Rick was in the most immediate danger, but Tilda would probably keep him alive until she had the Infinity Ring. Rick was smart and strong and likely had a trick or two up his sleeve. If there was any chance to escape, Rick would find it, and then Rick could warn Sera. Dak forced his fists to unclench. That wasn't much to base his hope on, but it was better than nothing. For now, the only thing Dak could do was to try to wedge his way closer to Hitler and make sure that once the fake plans from Mincemeat came through, Hitler would believe them. Dak half smiled. Yeah, just as easy as mincemeat pie. Except that there were a few complications. First, Hitler only took advice from the small group of people he trusted. That group didn't include Dak. Second, only a few people ever got close to Hitler at all, and as far as Dak knew, none of them were 11 years old. And third, if Dak ever did get close to Hitler, he could never pretend to be on Hitler's side long enough to convince him of anything. The man was too evil, too cruel. Dak knew that much pretending just wasn't in him. At some point, Dak must have fallen asleep against the wall because he awoke to the sound of a man and woman in the hallway just outside the kitchen. Even through the walls, he recognized Anton's voice, but it now bore a German accent.
Tilda said the boy was here.
At that, Dak's eyes sprung fully open. Instantly, he was wide awake, and trapped.
You know the Führer would not want us roaming around at night, a woman's voice said. We can look for the boy in the morning.
At one point, while he had been on the phone with Tilda, Dak had thought he heard her threaten to send SQ agents after him here in Berlin, but the static had been so thick on the phone he had hoped he heard wrong. Apparently not. He looked around for a place to hide, but where was he supposed to go? A cupboard?
Who are you more afraid of?
Anton asked.
Tilda or the Führer?
Dak asked himself the same question. It was sort of like asking which was the better way to die, by lightning or by getting thrown off a cliff. Neither option sounded particularly fun, and both ended the same way.
She said that if we don't catch him, this boy could destroy the SQ.
Anton paused while some closets were opened, searched, and shut again.
Maybe we shouldn't do this. Back at the Admiralty, one of the kids, the girl, told me she had been to the future, and that everything gets destroyed. I'm worried, Cleo. What if we are wrong?
Cleo scoffed at that.
Do you trust 3 kids more than Tilda? One of our own? She said she can stop the cataclysm, and I believe her. And if we help her, she will reward us well once she's in control. Now let's find the boy and then go after the others. And if the Führer catches us, he will say we are spying against him and have us arrested.
In his nervousness, Anton's voice was just a touch too loud.
Be quiet, or we will be caught, Cleo said. Let's check the kitchen. If he's not there, we can resume the search tomorrow.
The kitchen? Where he was? Just his luck. They could have chosen any of a dozen rooms to search, but of course, they chose the one place he was. Dak darted one direction, and then the next, hoping a good hiding spot would pop out at him. But it was too late, and the kitchen door was already opening. So he ducked behind a cabinet and folded himself into the smallest ball he could make, and waited to be caught. From a certain angle, he would be all too visible.
He won't be in here, Anton said. If he was allowed to spend the night in these headquarters, they'd have given him a bed. But I think this time traveler will be awake tonight, Cleo answered. He'll be snooping around the place.
Awake, yes, but snooping around a bunker loaded with Nazis? No. Dak considered himself brave, but not stupid.
Check the back of the room, Cleo ordered. I'll look over here.
The back of the room? Dak figured the only thing that could have made him more obvious back here was if a large blinking arrow somehow lit up over his head. He could see Cleo's reflection in a metal cabinet between them. She wasn't much taller than him, but was built like a wrestler. Her dark hair was pulled back into a neat bun, and her face was pinched with irritation.
Be ready for when we find him, Cleo said. When you see him, just do it fast.
Dak understood those words. They wouldn't question him or give him a warning. There would be no chances for escape, and no one would come to rescue him here. They wanted him dead, and nothing else. But then the door opened, and a new voice said, "You two, what are you doing up so late?" The tension in the room shot up so quickly, Dak could actually feel the change in the air.
Colonel von Renner, we were just searching for a lost ring, Cleo said.
Von Renner? Dak had heard the name before, but couldn't quite place it. He reassured himself that if he were not on the brink of being captured, tortured, and likely killed either by the SQ or by the Nazis, that he could probably remember who Colonel von Renna had been. Whose ring? Von Renna surveyed the room until his gaze fell directly on Dak, who quickly waved his hands, silently begging the German not to reveal him. He knew that he must have looked scared and alone, but Dak didn't care if he did. He was scared and alone. Von Renna turned back to Cleo. You can find your ring in the morning. Until then, the Führer does not want people wandering the halls at all hours of the night. Now go. Yes, Colonel, Anton said, hastily sweeping both himself and Cleo out the door. Once they had gone, von Renna impatiently said, Well, come out, boy. Dak poked his head up over the counter to find von Renna staring back at him, arms folded. He was a thin man whose short, neatly combed hair revealed a deep widow's peak, and he wore round glasses that gave him a strict, studious look. He didn't seem to be the type of person who smiled often, but then his voice was also gentler than Dak had expected from a high-ranking Nazi. At least von Renna had sent the SQ duo away. Dak figured his odds of surviving the next few minutes were pretty even. I haven't seen you before, von Renna said to Dak. Dak said nothing, mostly because he was sure if he tried speaking, it would come out in some high-pitched squeal of terror that'd wake the entire house. Can you tell me why those two were looking for you? Von Renna asked. What might two Nazis want with a young boy working in the kitchen? Okay, maybe he wouldn't scream, but he was also pretty sure his mouth had forgotten how to form actual words. So Dak only shrugged his shoulders and hoped the end would come quickly and painlessly. I think you must have played a joke on them and gotten caught, von Renna said. Yes? Well, yes. If the joke was getting himself inside the most dangerous place in Germany. Then von Renna smiled, just a little. I suppose I played a joke or two myself when I was younger, but these are not the kind of people you want to tease. No, sir, Dak mumbled. Frankly, he was already pretty clear on that fact. And remember that you now owe me a favor in return. Do not forget. Dak nodded. If there was one thing he would never forget, it was what von Renna had just done for him. Now let's have no more trouble, von Renna said. Something has been found in Spain, something that might give us a great advantage over the Allies, and there is tension in the bunker. You'll be smart to stay out of everyone's way. Yes, sir, Dak mumbled. Von Renna nodded at him, then left the kitchen. Once he'd gone, Dak slumped back down to the ground, exhausted, and never so scared in his life. Chapter 13. Sera's Warnings. Sera had intended to call Rick that first evening. She felt desperate to know how he was and whether Dak had made it to Germany safely. But she had the chilling feeling somebody was watching her. Most likely that creepy Klaus. It wasn't worth the risk to make a phone call. She did, however, discover a surprising fact that made her want to call Rick even more. One of their first adventures had been on board Christopher Columbus's ship as it sailed for the New World. This Spanish city, Huelva, had looked familiar to her from the start, but it was only after she began wandering the busy port town that she realized why. 450 years had changed a lot of things, but not the basic landscape. She was now less than 10 miles from where she, Dak, and Rick had boarded Columbus's ship. For such a small coastal lagoon in the big world, it had seen its share of history. Dak would completely geek out about that, but not tonight, not until she was sure it was safe to call. In the meantime, she had to live the life of a spy, and that meant lying. Something that Sera wasn't altogether comfortable with. It was one thing to lie to Klaus, but the doctor seemed like a good man, and Sera took no pleasure in deceiving him. She'd managed to convince him that she'd come to town from an impoverished village in order to pursue her love of science, something her family didn't understand. He allowed her to stay the night in a small room above his garage, but warned her that he would be putting her on the next bus out of town. "A girl's place is with her family," he had said. Sera hadn't had to fake the lump in her throat at hearing that. Until then, she had managed to avoid thinking about how her parents had been SQ. But now, she felt torn. Her mind struggled to understand how they could have aligned themselves with such evil people, and her heart longed for an explanation that would make everything okay. Despite everything, she still wanted to see them again. Sera spent the following day hoping to bump into Klaus, but he was nowhere to be found. The day after that was a funeral for Major Martin, attended by the same British officer who had been at the post-mortem, some disinterested Spanish officers, and a few curious people from the town. Even if she hadn't been there on spy duty, Sera wanted to attend the ceremony. She might have been the only person there who knew Major Martin was really a homeless man who died a few months ago from eating rat poison. He may not have given his life for his country, but he had given his death. For that, he deserved to be honored. A couple of times during the funeral, she saw the top of Klaus's crisp blonde hair poking into people's whispered conversations as if eavesdropping for anything suspicious. Perhaps he was hoping Martin's briefcase might somehow fall from the sky and land in his lap. But it wasn't until the guests left that he found her sitting on a bench near the cemetery. Just to have him beside her felt like a cold wind had blown in, but she kept her calm.
"I heard a rumor that Major Martin drowned at sea," he said. "Probably after his plane crashed."
"That's what the doctor decided."
"Why didn't any other bodies wash up on shore? Where's the plane wreckage?"
"Don't appear too obvious," Sera reminded herself. If she was supposed to be on Germany's side, then she should be hopeful, but not yet convinced. "That's a good point," she said. "You should probably wait another week or two and see if anything else washes up."
"Stupid girl!"
Klaus crossed his legs and turned away from her.
"If Martin was carrying information, we can't wait 2 weeks to get it."
Sera tried to hide her smile. That's what she'd hoped he'd think. Who was stupid now?
"Martin had papers with him, correct? In a briefcase?"
Sera nodded. She wanted to tell him the entire fake plan, to convince him right then that Martin was real, that Britain was invading Greece and not Sicily, and that he should tell Hitler just to surrender now. But the truth was that she hadn't seen anything written on the papers. Right now, it was more important to make Klaus trust her. And to get that trust, she had to tell him the truth. "He had papers," she said. "But I couldn't see what they said. There were envelopes inside the briefcase, too, and they were sealed." Then, just in case it helped, she added, "The British officer in the room didn't seem very happy that Spain has them." Klaus smiled.
"That's because many officials in Spain quietly support Germany in this war. But they can't just hand the papers over to us. Our work must be subtler."
He stood and withdrew from his pocket a single coin.
"That's for your trouble."
"Only one?" Sera said. "This won't buy anything."
"Then find me more information," Klaus said.
Sera nodded, and he left. Only then did her heart begin to beat normally again. Had she done enough? Would the papers really make their way into German hands without any further effort on her part? She was so lost in thought that she didn't realize the doctor was approaching her until he sat on the bench where Klaus had just been. "Sera, why were you speaking with that man?" he asked. "Klaus?" Sera tried to keep her cool, but her heart rate was already back up again. "He was curious about Major Martin. He wanted to know what happened to the briefcase. She decided to go for it. "I told him I was curious about that, too. Do you know what the man who took it will do with it?" The doctor scowled.
He will keep it under lock and key until he's ordered to take it to his superiors in Madrid. It's none of my business. And if you're smart, you'll leave it alone too." But the doctor grabbed her shoulders and nearly shook her. "Right now, Martin's papers are at the center of a world war. If you meddle, you will get in the way of some very dangerous people." He released her and then pulled some money from his pocket, which he shoved into her hands. "Klaus isn't fooling anyone. He's almost certainly spying for Berlin. If you need money, it isn't worth making a devil's bargain with him. Take this instead. Use it to leave town. Return to your family while you can. The Nazi spies will know you saw those papers. I never should have allowed you in that room. I wish I had not been in that room." Sera pocketed the money and thanked him, promising she would consider what he'd said. Then she made her way back into town. The worry in the doctor's voice bothered her more than she wanted to admit. Obviously she knew this was dangerous, but hadn't she been playing a dangerous game since the moment she and Dax stumbled into time travel? What made anything different now? Sera knew the answer. On past missions, she had Rick with her, or Dak, or both of them. Now, they were all separated, all fighting their individual battles, and she felt totally cut off from even knowing whether both boys were still okay. "Focus," Sera told herself. Focus on the job that had to be done. For now, that was the most important thing. So she went back to hunting for any information that might be useful to Klaus. She hoped to hear some gossip or rumors about what was happening to Martin's papers, but if anyone had something worth sharing, they didn't let her in on the conversation. It was strange to be in the spy business, pretending to want one thing when she really wanted the very opposite. It was exhausting, actually. The following evening, Sera decided to take the risk and call Rick. It had been 5 days since she'd arrived in Spain, and she hadn't dared make a phone call, but she couldn't go without hearing news any longer. She found a payphone not far from a fruit stand and dialed the number Rick had given her. She let it ring once, then hung up, then retrieved her coin and dialed again. It rang only once before someone picked up. "Hello?" Rick asked. Sera was so happy to hear a friendly voice, her words came out in an explosion of information. She told him about the post-mortem examination, Klaus, and even Columbus's ship. Finally, she drew in a breath long enough to hear him telling her to stop talking. "Why?" she asked. "What's wrong? Is Dak okay? Are you?" Now that she was listening, Rick's voice was clearly strained. "Do you still have the infinity ring?" he asked. "Yes, of course. Why?" "You need to leave Spain. Go anywhere. Get—" Then his words ended in a groan, and the phone went silent. "Rick!" Sera yelled. "Rick!" Someone on the other end of the line picked up the phone. She heard breathing before any words were spoken. Then someone whispered, "Sera?" The voice was like she imagined a snake would sound. "Sera? Do you know who I am?" "Tilda." Sera's hand began shaking so hard she almost dropped the phone. "If you leave the country with that infinity ring, what do you think will happen to Rick?" "Leave him alone!" "Tomorrow, Rick and I will be in Madrid, the capital of Spain. If you want him back, then meet me in Retiro Park at noon with the infinity ring. Beside the lake is a large monument. Be there, or you will never see Rick again." Sera started to answer, but the line went dead. She hung up her phone and clutched the sack holding the infinity ring in her hands. What was she supposed to do now? There wasn't time for her to answer her own question. Only seconds after she left the phone booth, Klaus appeared and gripped her arm so tightly it made her wince. He dug into her pocket and pulled out the money from the doctor.
"Who gave you this?"
"The doctor at the morgue."
"And who were you talking to just now?"
Sera tried to break free, but it did no good. "A friend of mine who's coming to Madrid. I have to go see him. Now, let me go."
"Madrid?"
Klaus released her arm, but stepped closer to her.
You don't have enough money to get there.
No, she didn't. And she couldn't use the infinity ring again. Not so soon. There had to be another way. I'm trying to get you more information, Sera said. You could pay me now, and then
I have a better plan.
Klaus withdrew an envelope from his suit jacket and held it out to her.
If you safely deliver this letter for me, I will help you get to Madrid.
Deliver the letter? To who? Sera figured she was already in enough trouble, and so was Rick. Mince McMann would have to wait until she knew what to do about Tilda. Klaus sighed.
I tried everything I could think of to get Major Martin's papers these past few days. No matter what I try, the officials here are protecting them far too well. So well, in fact, that I am sure they must contain some important information.
Very important, Sera thought. So important that it was driving her crazy. Spain was supposed to hand the papers over to the Nazis, not protect them. Klaus continued.
Martin's briefcase is being sent to Madrid today. It is very embarrassing to me to lose access to it, and the Führer will be disappointed in my failures. This letter is for my friend in Madrid. It explains why I could not get the briefcase, and hopefully he can explain to the Führer.
Why not just mail it, or deliver it yourself? Sera asked.
Letters such as these do not go through the mail, and this town is my post. I'm not allowed to leave.
Sera folded her arms and stared up at him. So you'll pay my way to Madrid, and then trust me to carry that letter there? Klaus shook his head.
I don't trust anyone. But I also know that if there's any trouble along the way, the Allies will never search a young girl. And if you fail to deliver this letter, or if you open it yourself, my friend in Madrid will find you, and please believe me when I say that he is more desperate and far less kind than I am.
Sera reached for the letter, but saw nothing written for the address. Who is it for?
Major Karl Erich Kullenthal. He is one of Hitler's most trusted men in Spain, or he once was. If he doesn't get Martin's papers, then his career is finished.
What does he think about Major Martin?
Klaus shrugged. If Kullenthal can get the papers, and if they're real, then he will save his career. So for his sake, I hope they are real.
For safekeeping, Sera stuffed the letter in the bag holding the infinity ring. Before dropping her off at the train station, Klaus even bought her a small suitcase to help her look more like a traveler, then put her on a train to Madrid.
Major Kullenthal should meet you at the train station. But if he doesn't, then you can always find him at the Spanish ministry. Give him this letter, and then stay out of his way if you want to be safe.
Sera nodded and ran his words through her mind as the train pulled away from the station. She would give Kullenthal the letter, and she definitely wanted to be safe. But if Mince McMann was going to succeed, the last thing she could do was stay out of his way.